Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Introducing Net Zero Real Estate Pioneers for China and Hong Kong CRREM Early Adopter Program, co-organized by Allied Sustainability and Environmental Consultants Group, Limited, AEC Group, Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor CRREM, and Greater Bay Area Carbon Neutrality Association. I'm Grace Kwok, Chairman and Executive Director of AEC Group. I will be the moderator for this webinar. Joining today's panel, we are very happy to have CRREM's project lead, Ms. Julie Wen, Science-Based Targets Initiative Senior Project Officer, Mr. Amir Khan, LinkGrid's Head of Sustainability and Risk Governance, Dr. Calvin Lee Kwan, who will join us in the discussion section later, and AEC Group Assistant Manager of the ESG team, Mr. Kurt Kam. AEC Group is honored to be the training partner of CRREM in Hong Kong and China and contribute to the first ever Chinese guideline of setting decarbonization targets, how to apply the CRREM pathways for China and Hong Kong, which was published in 2023. Over 1/3 of global carbon emissions are produced by the real estate sector. The percentage is even higher in Hong Kong, with over 60% of carbon footprint coming from the building sector. So we have a critical role to play in tackling the climate crisis by accelerating the net zero transition. We believe that the net zero transition necessitates the proper instrument to assist businesses of all sizes in their decarbonization journey. With a focus on Hong Kong and mainland China, our partnerships with CRREM has also been strengthened even more with the launch of the 8-month Net Zero Real Estate Pioneers for China and Hong Kong CRREM Early Adopter Program that aims to inform, instruct, and encourage the adoption of the CRREM-SBTi aligned decarbonization pathways for Hong Kong and mainland China. To give you a better overview, our esteemed panel speakers will walk us through the current development of CRREM, the SBTi2 for building sector, and the Early Adopter Program, followed by a panel discussion and Q&A section. So please feel free to enter your question into our Zoom's Q&A box with the speaker's name, and we will answer your question after the main discussion. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Ms. Julia Wen, CRREM's project lead, to share with us some insights on the essence of net zero target setting and transition risk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Grace, for the introduction. Nice to have you here. So good afternoon to all of you that are listening. I will start sharing a couple of slides. So just give me one second. And I hope you can see my screen now. So yeah, great that I can be here today, and I will kick off this webinar with the sense of net zero target setting and transition risk management. As Grace already said in the introduction, the real estate sector really plays a large role in regards to CO2 emissions, and especially maybe in also some countries like Hong Kong, that part might be even larger. And why is it though so important that we track our performance, that we know where we are? Because we want to assess the risks that we will be facing, that we are having. It's we always say it's so important to be ahead of the curve, be ahead of the game, so you can also maybe place yourself ahead of the competition. And this is also where CRREM comes into play. I will say more on CRREM in a second. But basically, transition risks in real estate, we did a survey here, and this is just some of the results that we have found. And actually, most of these points, as you will see in a second, are quite important to all stakeholders, whether you're an asset owner, whether you're an asset manager, investor, or even banks. The financial sector is also trying to really assess their financed emissions right now. So even with banks here, this role is becoming more and more important to see where am I at and what risks, what costs might I be facing in the future. And if you're pricing in those risks, then that gives you the advantage to act fast and also mitigate some of those risks. So first point here, of course, we had feedback here a very large amount, or the majority said, okay, some of the risks that we will be facing is increasing pressure from NGOs, from the stakeholders, from the public. Also very highly rated is fear of increasing economic obsolescence. So of course here, maybe in the future, tenants will be looking, what's the energy efficiency of my asset? Maybe I want to choose an asset which is more energy efficient, where I might have less costs. Also here, CO2 intensity, energy intensity is slowly starting to pick up in regards to valuations. In my final paper now of my dissertation, I'm doing a hedonic regression, and I'm assessing the impact of CO2 intensity on the gross asset value. And even here, we already see a significance. So this point is also, of course, very, very important. Loss of reputations. A couple of years ago, we saw more of the greenwashing. It was nice. Companies used maybe a nice graph in their marketing, in their annual report for marketing. Now, of course, ESG is center stage, and we really see the knowledge, the know-how in the market picking up. So loss of reputation is really, really a key factor here as well. Yeah, the market knows about this topic and is really paying attention to it. Next point. Also, as you can see, all of these points are actually quite important in our survey, and this also applies to expected rise in carbon prices. So here also in some countries already, we actually have an increase in carbon prices, also applying to real estate emissions, and of course the projection that these carbon prices, energy prices are of course also increasing in the future. So here again, you can make the calculation. Do I want to pay the carbon prices, taxes in the future, or maybe I want to do an energetic retrofit and also improve again my performance? Need for reporting, increasing reporting requirements, of course, tightening regulations is of course also very important, and this is also a key driver. And of course, you might be expecting in the future maybe regulations might be tightening, getting more strict. And here is also very important, as you want to be ahead here in case a regulation comes up. Of course, in the real estate sector, sometimes it's a bit more slow moving. You might have a tenant in your asset, so you might not be able to do an energetic retrofit as quickly. But if a regulation comes, that might make you act fast. And here again, you might have high costs where you need to act. Maybe you need to do an energetic retrofit quickly. So you need to have that capital available and that liquidity to perform an energetic retrofit. And lastly, last but not least, increasing pressure from the market. Of course, here we also see a lower demand from the market, especially to those assets that are not performing as great in terms of CO2 and energy intensity. So this is setting the scene and giving a brief overview. Of course, these are just some example. The list goes on. But yeah, as you can see, it's really important to assess this. And how can we assess this? One of the methods is using CRREM, the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, where we apply some benchmarks for the sector, where you can then assess either your asset or look at it on an aggregated view and assess your portfolio performance against our benchmarks. Before I say more on CRREM, very quickly, we are based on the global CO2 budget, also completely aligned with SBTi now. So the new pathways benchmarks here are also aligned with SBTi, and it's not getting more. The sector is continuing to use up. We're having an overshoot, and that leads that the pathways, of course, will get stricter and steeper in the future. So those pathways, they're not static until 2050. CRREM will do an update every 3 years. And of course, it could be very likely if the sector has an overshoot and we're using up more of that budget, then of course that will lead to the CRREM pathways will get stricter as well. As you can see in this diagram here, of course, the building sector does play quite a large role. So here we can definitely assume that also regulations and so on will also be applying to the real estate sector. Now, looking at time, more on CRREM. So as I already mentioned, CRREM provides a benchmark that is transparent, science-based, and to see if you are Paris aligned 1.5 degrees. We also have pathways for the 2-degree pathway, but we really see the sector going towards 1.5 degrees. A final note here also, we're looking at the operational carbon intensity and the use phase. And why is this so important? Because of course, in 2050, 80% of the building stock is already built today. We're not going to tear down everything, build new. So it's really important that we optimize that standing stock here. So here, of course, CRREM only covers operational. On the other side, of course, embodied carbon might also be very important. How do the CRREM pathways actually look like? As I said, we have a benchmark for you to assess if you're Paris compliant or not. And of course, maybe it might not be fair to assess an asset which is located in Europe against to benchmark that same asset. Maybe that's located in China or Japan. And so here CRREM has developed country-specific and property type specific pathways, because also same not only on country level but on property type level, it's not fair to benchmark an office building against a residential building. They have a completely different energy mix, use type, and so on, and therefore we have those very use type specific pathways, and we have the benchmark for 44 countries. And the first step is to create one global pathway. And from this global pathway, which is also fully aligned with the SBTi, we then create country-specific and property type-specific pathways. So maybe in France, you have quite a green energy mix. They're creating their electricity with a lot of nuclear power plants. The benchmark here starts lower. In other countries, maybe in Japan, here you might also have a different climate. You have a different energy intensity. And of course, you produce your energy in a different way. So Japan, the benchmark starts higher. So the starting point will always be the country and property type specific average. But then in 2050, of course, we all have to end at net zero, and we all converge to the same point. And this, of course, also applies to all of the other countries that we have. And as I already mentioned, we have pathways for 44 countries. Moving on to my final slide here, how does the assessment also look on asset level? Of course, this is then also available on portfolio level. So here on asset level, you can then say we have that CRREM benchmark and we can input our asset specific data to then create a asset baseline performance. This is the straight line here. However, we have a corrected asset performance because we also consider HDD and CDD, heating and cooling degree days, and also the grid decarbonization. So in a lot of countries, even though we assume the climate will get warmer, we might need more energy for cooling. On the other hand, the electricity grid will also decarbonize, and actually our asset performance might be getting slightly better until 2050. But this is maybe not enough. Maybe we also have to do an energetic retrofit to also get the energy intensity a bit better. However, now we can, of course, see that our performance, maybe in the beginning, it's still a little bit better. And then at this point, you're above the benchmark. And from this point onwards, you're no longer 1.5 compliant. And you might have some excess emissions. You can put a price to those emissions and then see what is maybe my cost of those emissions, my total costs. And you can then very easily also do a risk assessment and see what, where am I based, what costs am I facing, and maybe how's the regulation also moving. So in a lot of countries, we can see the regulation slowly also aligning to the CRREM pathways. But in general, this is already a first introduction. And now, of course, we will hear more about this topic. Thank you again. And please post any questions that you have in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for the very concise and informative introduction of CRREM. So okay, so now let's invite Mr. Amir Khan, SBTi's Senior Project Officer, who will talk about how SBTi works on the targets together with CRREM. Thank you, Amir.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I'm just sharing my screen. I hope everyone can see that okay. Perfect. Great. So thanks again, everyone, for joining today, and Grace and the team for giving us this opportunity. So as mentioned, I'll be taking the opportunity today to speak to you all about SBTi and the building sector in particular. But I'll be giving a brief overview of science-based targets and how they are relevant for your organization in order to drive efforts to decarbonize and mitigate risks to your business. You saw Julia present some of those in the results of the survey just before. There will also be time for the Q&A, so please do submit your questions. And I have my colleagues Maria and Isla also listening in case there are any questions relevant for them to answer. So just very quickly, firstly, about the SBTi, in case you aren't familiar. The Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTi, is an organization focusing on corporate climate action. So essentially, we empower companies and financial institutions globally to address the climate crisis. So how do we do this? We do this by creating standards, tools, and guidance documents to assist companies in establishing greenhouse gas emission reduction targets aligned with the necessary actions to limit global warming to manageable levels and achieve net zero emissions by 2050 at the very latest. And you can see on the slide that we have partner organizations and also an independent target validation function. So in terms of progress to date, this has been really positive. We have already over 4,500 companies setting science-based targets, which have been validated by our independent team. And we have over 7,600 companies globally committed to climate action, if we include both those who have set their targets and those who have committed to set targets. And we have already reached a key milestone, which we call a critical mass of over 20% of high impact companies, setting targets in many sectors and across many regions globally. It really shows that SBTs are becoming mainstream. In Asia alone, we have over 2,000 organizations committed to set targets, and almost 100 of these are real estate companies. So we've seen massive growth in our engagement with companies in the region, but like we all know, more work needs to be done. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to very quickly introduce the Buildings Project team, now that you've heard a bit about the SBTi. So firstly, we have Carl Downey. He is our head of sectoral development. So Carl leads the team that deals with all different types of sectors, such as buildings here. We have Ali Dinchai, our buildings lead, and Maria Garcia, our technical manager. So my colleagues Isla and Maria are our subject matter experts. You have myself, Amir Khan, Senior Project Officer, and also Paulina Moreno, the Communications Manager for the project. You might be asking what exactly are science-based targets? Well, the best way to explain this is to look at our net zero standard. And this essentially lays out the full framework. So these long-term net zero targets are made up of 4 key elements displayed on the screen. The first is a 1.5 degrees C aligned near-term target. So that is a target with a time frame of 5 to 10 years. The second element is a long-term science-based target. So this is a target that would essentially ask companies to reduce their emissions to a residual level by 2050 or sooner. So that is an over 90% reduction in emissions compared to today's levels. The third element on the screen you can see is optional. So science-based targets are based on real emissions reductions within the value chain, and so we do not rely on offsets or compensation. However, this does not mean that such actions beyond the value chain cannot have value to help reduce emissions in other parts of the economy, for example. Therefore, companies may wish to embark on these as a voluntary additional action, which we call beyond value chain mitigation, And recently, colleagues have released a couple of really interesting reports on the topic, so feel free to have a look online for those reports on beyond value chain mitigation. And the fourth and final part is when a company reaches its very low emissions by its long-term target date, it must further commit to reducing those residual emissions to reach net zero. And this is done through permanent removals from the atmosphere. And one important note is that companies not wanting to set long-term targets can set only a near-term target if they so wish. So what methods can companies and financial institutions use to set targets or SBTs? And this is relevant for our collaboration with CRREM, which I'll get onto very shortly, but very quickly, I think it's important to have this context. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we have the method that is used for large homogeneous sectors, such as is the case with buildings here, and essentially companies are expected to converge towards a sector decarbonization path in terms of carbon intensity. So that is kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for the building sector. And we refer to this method as a sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA. And the other method on the right is what is used for all other sectors that don't have an appropriate SDA. And this is called a cross-sector absolute reduction or contraction approach. And essentially, this expects all companies to reduce emissions at the same linear annual rate. So there you can see that it's 4.2% per year. Now, moving on to the buildings project, I should note that companies from this sector could already set targets using our tool, and many have already done so. But we launched this project to provide more detailed guidance to the sector and also to upgrade the ambition to 1.5 degrees C aligned targets. And at the moment, we have companies piloting our draft guidance and tool. Why was it important for SBTi to offer specific guidance for this sector? These points have already been mentioned, but very quickly, the building sector is a major contributor of emissions worldwide, accounting for more than a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the sector is also growing quite a bit faster than other industries. And as well as that point, it is quite complex, as you all know, so better guidance was needed by the SBTi to help companies in this sector set targets. And of course, we need immediate climate action to be taken by the sector to avoid the worst impact of climate breakdown. So what does this guidance intend to do? Essentially, SBTs indicate how much and by when an individual company should reduce its emissions from its operations and value chain to be in line with the carbon budget. So SBTs are different to asset level standards, certification schemes, or assessments in that they are set at the organizational level. So the aforementioned standards and schemes are complementary tools for designing and managing ways for buildings to be operated in a sustainable fashion. But SBTs cannot and are not intended to be used to assess the current performance of a company or an asset. The aims of our project can be summarized in 3 very clear objectives. The first one is the production of granular 1.5 degrees C aligned pathways for in-use emissions of global building sector, which we developed together with CRREM, and those were published in January last year. The second objective is fairly similar, but for embodied emissions of newly constructed buildings. And again, those pathways are global and also 1.5 degrees C aligned. And the third objective really ties everything together in that we issue guidance for emissions accounting, reporting and target setting for all stakeholders within the sector and along the value chain. And some of the intended users you can see are listed, so developers, building owners and occupiers, as well as FIs. And we also have a building specific target setting tool that companies can use to calculate their targets using the new building pathways. Both the in-use and embodied emissions pathways are contained within that tool. So what do the CRREM pathways look like in the SBTi target setting tool? Well, here is a quick example. Here we have a speculative office portfolio in Brisbane with 140,000 meters squared of assets to demonstrate how the tool and the SDA works with the CRREM-SBTi curve. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the yellow curve is the industry curve or average. So this is the CRREM-SBTi pathway for the selected building type and geography. And the blue curve here is the company-specific pathway for the selected buildings in the company's portfolio. And you can see that in this case, the company's base year performance is slightly above the industry curve, but it will converge towards the net zero point by 2050. Wrapping up now, this is my last slide. At the moment, the project is undergoing piloting. So essentially, companies are testing our resources, and we expect to hopefully finalize this in the coming weeks, and then we will be able to announce when the final publication will take place. And as mentioned, companies and financial institutions can already set targets using the cross-sector methods, so you don't necessarily have to wait for building guidance. But if you're interested, the draft guidance and other materials can be found on our webpage. And lastly, if you have any questions and would like to reach out to myself or the team, please do contact us using the email on the screen or pass your queries to Grace and the team at AEC who can pass those on to us. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it back over to Grace.
Thank you, Ami, for the introduction. Looking forward to the publication of the final two. So now let's pass the time to Mr. Kurt Tam, AEC Group's Assistant Manager of ESG team, to introduce the Net Zero Real Estate Pioneers for China and Hong Kong CRREM Early Adopter Program. Over to you, Kurt. Thank you. Kurt, maybe you're mute. We can't hear you, sorry.
Okay.
But there's some feedback.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. Okay, I'll continue. So I'm Kurt from the Align Environmental Consultants Limited AEC. Okay, so today I would like to introduce to you the details of the Net Zero Real Estate Pioneers for China and Hong Kong CRREM Early Adopter Program. This is co-organized by AEC, the Global CRREM Initiative, and the Greater Bay Area Carbon Neutrality Association. Next slide, please. AEC is a pioneer sustainability and environmental consulting firm, striving to provide one-stop on-demand services to our client. Our core business focuses on climate resilience and ESG, as well as a sustainable built environment. The Early Adopter Program aims to promote the adoption of the CRREM-SBTi aligned decarbonization pathway in Hong Kong and Mainland China, and assist companies in understanding the transition risk in their portfolio. We support companies in decarbonizing their real estate portfolio, and the program enables us to discuss and resolve jointly potential pitfalls. Upon the completion of the program, a report on overall findings in the program will be delivered. The Early Adopter Program will last for 8 months from March to December this year. It is supported by various organizations, including the HKGFA, HKGBC, SBTi, CREC-CHKI, CGBC, GREPS, and GBIUA. The technical advice will be provided by the Global CRREM Initiative. We target real estate fund and developers, facilities manager to provide their asset level data and feedback. We expect 10 to 20 participants to provide the data for their selected scope of assets. In the Early Adopter Program, we are mainly looking for buildings located in Hong Kong and cities in Mainland China. Of asset types range from office, retail to residential purposes. We require 1 year of performance data to conduct the assessment. There will be 3 meetings in total. The first one will be a group meeting for briefing on data collection, followed by a meeting on preliminary results and potential improvement based on the collected data, and the final meeting on the debriefing. As the global CRREM initiative is a not-for-profit organization, the application fee will be used to cover the cost of AEC in conducting data analysis. The application fee is of 6,000 Hong Kong dollars as the early bird period has already passed. Okay. As CRREM's first partner in Hong Kong and China, AEC strives to support companies of all sizes in their decarbonization journey and to accelerate the net zero transition of real estate sector in the Asia-Pacific region. We are committed to introduce and demonstrating the effectiveness of CRREM tools in helping companies in achieving their decarbonization targets while addressing the carbon risks associated within their real estate portfolio. Through this partnership with CRREM, AEC is committed to driving the adoption of sustainable practices in the real estate sector. We believe that the CRREM tools and the early adopter program is highly beneficial to our participants. It allows participants to develop a deep understanding in the GHG emission in their portfolio for assessment and benchmarking, and enables investors to align the real estate portfolios against Paris-compliant decarbonization pathways. The tool also enables the visualization of the energy performance for individual properties, portfolios, and companies. It provides participants with the option to use their own assumption or rely on the CRREM's default data. It supports the development and monitoring of science-based targets, and it applies proven and reliable methodology based on SBTi SDA convergence approach. Furthermore, the methodology enables the development of mitigation strategy. For instance, it allows the monitorization of transition risk for operational carbon emissions and analysis of the impact of retrofit on total carbon performance. It also supports transparency and communication regarding ESG targets and enable alignment with standards like TCFD, PCAF, apart from SBTi. Okay. So stranded assets are property that will not meet future energy efficiency standards and market expectation and might be increasingly exposed to the risk of early economic obsolescence. Stranding risk is affected by regulation changes, potential shifts in energy costs, and refurbishment measures, as mentioned by Julia before. So CRREM offers a straightforward graphical assessment of stranding risk of properties and whole portfolios. Okay. We use a whole building approach, which means that all in-use operational emissions are included, covering scope 1, 2, and 3, which is the emission from the tenants in the building. And we're applying the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. For this program, we strongly recommend the participant to provide a full 12-month data. I will further explain data required for the program in the following slides. Complete set of data is preferred for a more accurate analysis, although some data is optional. For general information, we need the asset name, selected 12-month period, and gross asset value, percentage of ownership. Reported period is set to be 12 months, and we allow only one entity per participant for our input. For building characteristics, we require the building address, property type, whether air conditioning was provided, total gross internal area, and average annual vacant area. We do encourage third-party audits for the data provided, ideally with an in-use green building certification. For whole building data, we require data from both the common areas and the tenant space. The data include the consumption of energy of grid electricity, natural gas, fuel oil, and district cooling, preferably in kilowatt hour. Also, the coverage area and the coverage area with energy supply. Okay. To better assess the building emissions, we need data of fugitive emissions, including the type of refrigerant loss and the amount of leakage. Okay. Use of renewable energy is also important in our assessment. We would like information about renewable energy generated on-site and off-site For instance, from solar panels, wind turbines, heat pumps, or solar thermal collectors. Participants can provide details of their retrofit actions, including investment costs, achieved reduction of energy consumption, and their own estimation of embodied carbon. Okay, so here we have some graphical illustration for the assessment output on the asset level. In the graph on the right, we can see the trending year and emission budget with and without retrofit against the region and property type specific decarbonization pathway. In the second graph, we can see the energy reduction pathway of an asset in contrast to the country and property type specified energy target. And in the third graph, we can see the energy and carbon cost over time against decarbonization pathway. On the portfolio level, the results can show the share of stranded assets within the portfolio by floor area or GAV over time, enable the comparison of the share of stranded asset between individual assets or specified aggregation. In the second graph, we can see the portfolio average GHG and energy intensity is plotted against a 1.5 degree pathway. So we can see the portfolio pathway is compared with the Paris compliant pathway. In summary, the early adopter program offers guidance to companies of all sizes in the Asia Pacific region to align their decarbonization ambition in the real estate industry against the Paris compliant decarbonization pathways. And this is my last slide. Thank you very much. So should you have any questions, you can email us according to the email address on screen, and also by the number on screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kurt, for walking us through the CRREM Early Adopter Program. So now it's time for our panel discussion. We have Julia, Amir, Kurt, and also Dr. Kelvin Ni Kwan, Link REIT's Head of Sustainability and Risk Governance, joining us today. Thank you for joining us, Kelvin. So meanwhile, our audience can feel free to enter your questions into the Zoom Q&A box with the speaker's name, and we will answer some of your questions after our discussion. In our discussion, we'll cover the latest development of CRREM pathways in Hong Kong and mainland China, insights into utilizing CRREM-SBTi aligned decarbonization pathway in Hong Kong and mainland China, as well as some key benefits in the CRREM Early Adopter Program. So my first question goes to Julia. Julia, CRREM is a worldwide initiative that supports companies in assessing the required reduction in carbon emissions at asset level. What do you think makes CRREM such an important tool out of all the options in the current market?
Yeah, thank you very much. Basically here, I think our goal is to become the global standard for assessing your assets or even portfolio level. I mean, we see it's really an ESG jungle sometimes, and I think the sector and the market just needs more alignment, and this is really where CRREM comes into play, because we can just directly see, okay, are we Paris 1.5 degrees compliant or not? Of course, we don't focus on the national regulations or laws. So of course, you should always remember, even if you are using CRREM, maybe you should also see, okay, is there any rules or regulations on the national level? And of course, also make sure that you comply to those in addition. But in general, CRREM is really becoming the global standard over, I think we're already covering, and it's not mandatory. So with this, we're already covering over 20% of the commercial real estate sector that is benchmarking against CRREM. And I think that's a really great uptake, and we really still see those numbers increasing. And what also makes us so great, I think, as I already mentioned before, is because we offer those country-specific and property type specific benchmarks. Basically, everyone on the globe knows what the CRREM pathway is, whether I'm in the US and I have an office building and I benchmark against the pathway, or if I'm in Japan or Hong Kong and I have an office building and I benchmark against the pathway. And just as that we are here so specific, I think that really makes us great. And also that we are aligned with a lot of initiatives, like I said, like with SBTi, and our data is really robust now. We're working together with a lot of data partners. In Singapore, for example, we had the OCBC Bank as our data partner. We have JPIF, the world's largest pension fund in Japan, supporting us, and so on. So we really have also robust and high quality benchmark.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
you bring us some very important points. You know, the data integrity, especially the robustness, and also, you know, when we are trying to benchmark the performance of the portfolio, we can, you know, do it not just at local, regional level, but also, you know, globally. That is also very important. So my next question to Amir. So SBTi's partnership with CRREM has gained a strong momentum in the market. So what are the primary objectives of this partnership in terms of helping the real estate sector to accelerate their decarbonization progress?
Yeah, thanks, Grace, for the question. So we began this collaboration with CRREM colleagues early on in the project, and that was to deliver one of the key objectives of our work, which I've mentioned, was to develop and integrate in-use operational emissions pathways that are aligned with net zero into the SBTi buildings tool. So companies can use this to set targets against their in-use emissions. So one of the key aspects of this collaboration is really to simplify and harmonize the decarbonization practices in the industry by using the same underlying data. So in this case, we're referring to the SBTi CRREM 1.5 degrees C aligned pathways. So SBTi and CRREM uses the same pathways, but for different purposes with different methods. So when setting SBTs using the upcoming guidance, companies would apply the SDA method that I briefly spoke about to the pathways. So essentially this gives companies tailored reduction targets that are aligned with their company's particular case, and also starting point with regards to base year emissions. So to sum up, I suppose, CRREM and SBTi have worked closely together to develop these fully aligned 1.5 degrees C in-use emissions decarbonization pathways. And these pathways will really help ensure that the appropriate reductions are made from buildings' operational greenhouse gas emissions. And we also provide regional in-use pathways for different types of buildings, or different building typologies that can better reflect the location and type of buildings that a company's emissions might stem from. For example, we have an option for buildings in Hong Kong to have targets set against them.
Yes, thank you, Amir. In fact, when I first heard of you know, the partnership between SBTi and CRREM, I'm very excited. And also, I think for a lot of assets or the building owners, they have set the target, but they have difficulties to find the right pathway to, you know, track the progress, whether it's aligned with the Paris goal. So this too is really helpful for the real estate sector. And we all know that, you know, no tool is perfect. And also we need to continue to improve it, well, especially after it's been used and tested under different scenarios, right? So my next question to Calvin. We understand that LinkGrid piloted the adoption of CRREM in 2021 and 2022 to measure the carbon footprint and transition risk exposure of the company's portfolios. As the head of sustainability and risk governance of LinkGrid, can you share with us what major climate-related risks are identified in the assessment, and how adopting CRREM2 assists LinkGrid in setting the SBTi net zero targets?
Sure, thanks, Grace. I think we might have participated before 2021. Julie, it goes back quite a bit, but I want to first, full disclosure. Yes, we were one of the early pilots and participants in the CRREM model. I want to underscore something that Julia mentioned, that you're hoping that CRREM becomes the preeminent benchmark for decarbonization in the real estate sector. And for most of the people on this call, we've heard this statement from a lot of different benchmarks and what they want to try and achieve. When I look at this, I think that there's really going to be three key criteria for any benchmark to become the preeminent one in the industry, right? Number one, it has to be simple to use. We're the ones that have to respond to this. We have to be able to put the data in. And when you look at CRREM, and you've seen the presentation that's been given right now, the data that you require, the data that CRREM requires is actually very straightforward. We all have that information. Number two, the results have to be easy to interpret. It has to be easy to understand. And you've seen the charts that are presented already, and you can identify right away where your stranded assets might be, when they'll be stranded, and how far you are, the gaps that you have between where you need to be. For me, that was checkbox number two. That's been done. And the third one really becomes, how useful is this particular model? I have to say that at the very beginning, it was already useful. And this was when the CRREM model itself was very European-centric. Julie, remember those discussions that we had, right? And in this situation, we were able to benchmark our entire portfolio to identify which ones we should prioritize in regards to decarbonization strategy. How do we deal with the energy use efficiency issues? Why are some properties higher energy use than others? And that strategically gave us a lot of insight into how to prioritize that portfolio for ongoing management. This then ties into things that we deal with from a CapEx perspective. So my three criteria for whether a benchmark is going to be preeminent is it must be simple to use, the results must be easy to understand, and it has to be useful. So in my opinion, these three boxes have been checked. And Julia, you also mentioned a couple of other things as well. Number one is you reminded us that, hey, each of your countries that you're in might have updates, and you have to factor that into your model as well. So the added transparency that you've provided, I think, certainly puts CRREM at the very top of the list of decarbonization standards and benchmarks for the real estate sector. So thank you very much for doing that. Link did this a few years ago. I've already given you some insight into how we've been able to use those results. We've prioritized our properties, identified which ones are going to be at higher risk, and started actually using that to mitigate some of the energy use initiatives. Now, we haven't used this to look at which assets to divest away from, which ones to invest more in, but we're going to move that towards that way. In the last couple of years, the last thing I'm going to say here is that in the last couple of years, CRREM has made a significant effort to take into account the local jurisdictions. So we're seeing that as these databases populate better, and that's going to rely on us in these respective geographies to put this information in, the model will become better. So if you're just getting started, I feel that the existing model, actually the first version of the model, was already good in helping us prioritize our property portfolio for decarbonization management. The current model, if it's updated with your particular geographies, then even better. So you'll get a better, more accurate assessment of where you stand right now.
Thank you very much, Calvin, for the clarification and explaining, the criteria for making the CRREM to an important, benchmarking to globally. So my next question to Kurt. The CRREM Early Adopter Program facilitated by AEC Group will enable investors to evaluate if their real estate portfolios are aligned with the CRREM-SBTi decarbonization pathway. So what are the key advantages for real estate developer to join this program?
Thank you, Grace. I think in Hong Kong, building accounts for about 19% of electricity consumption and 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. Like many places in the world, building accounts for significant portion of emission, which is why a lot of pressure is put on the real estate industry to decarbonize their portfolio to ensure a decarbonized economy by 2050. The early adopter program utilized the CRREM-2. Okay, first, I would like to list out some of the benefits of the CRREM-2, but first, I think there's many of the real estate companies is looking for the right resources to accept their transition risk. So for CRREM-2, it provides some to fill the gap of the data availability. So in assessing transition risk of building, and it provides massive amount of location and asset type specific default data for assessment. Okay, and also our as like a consultant in the early adopter program, AEC will provide information, instruction, and professional knowledge in guiding the companies, no matter big and small, in the real estate industry in Asia Pacific region to understand the transition risk in the portfolio. With this widely recognized standard and model based on the latest 1.5 degree sector-specific decarbonization pathway, thanks to the scale of country and regions and also property type. And I think with greater understanding after our introduction of the CRREM-2 in this program, the participant can have the flexibility in choosing their own, in inputting their own assumption, like electricity grid emission factor, embodied carbon, and carbon pricing, for example. Okay, but in this program, we will provide this kind of data to them to save their effort in doing further research. And also the CRREM model aligns with multiple standards like SBTi, PCAF, and for many listed companies, it will help them to comply with the reporting standards, like the one from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange ESG reporting standard regarding the climate disclosure under the TCFD recommendations.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Yeah, so I think most importantly, joining the CRREM adopter program would help us to speed up the process of using this tool, global benchmarking tool, as well as we could help to gather more data, right, for improving the pathway for this region. So my next question to Julia, may I ask if there's any plan for CRREM to adjust the pathways for mainland China, for example, in order to reflect the climate differences in heating or cooling between northern China and southern China? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Grace. I thought I heard an echo. I think it's fine. No, thank you. I already had a look in the chat box, and I already also saw some similar questions come up. So definitely happy to answer this. Moving forward, CRREM has taken, in terms of strategy, we're taking two focuses. One focus is the regions, so the regions that we're covering, and the other side is also the property types, so the sectors. Two very important parts, of course. In terms of regions, we're now also placing a focus on the US specifically, and also Asia Pacific. I think we already had a very good take-up in Europe, and it's maybe also a little bit easier in terms of data transparency and the country size. But we said, okay, we also have to focus on countries like America. Due to the size of the country, it's not fair just to have one pathway. And similarly, we have that, I would say, same issue or a challenge in China, mainland China. So right now we only have pathways for Hong Kong and then one pathway for mainland. And in a way, you might also, of course, say this is not really really fair here just to have one pathway. For me, I would say this is at the very top of the to-do list. Just we're struggling a little bit in terms of data. Of course, we can only publish something, and we also only want to publish something once we say, okay, we have a really strong databases. But we hope, of course, with this, like this pilot, for example, also with more uptake, that we will have more data in the future where we can then say, okay, we will publish regional specific pathways also for China. So this is definitely on our to-do list, but here maybe we just need a little bit more time to ensure if we publish something that we really have that high quality. And the same also applies to sectors. In a way, now we're focusing also on the different property types, especially focusing on logistics and the hotel asset class, as well as residential. Because of course, a residential asset, you might also have a little bit of a different use type if you have student housing or just a normal standard residential home. And the same also applies, for example, for hotels. Maybe it's not very fair if you say, I just have this 1-star or bed and breakfast asset next to my luxury 5-star hotel with a pool, a spa area, and so on. And here we also want to get a little bit more granular.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's great to hear about, this is the top of your to-do list, and also and then having more granularity in the different building typology. That's also very important. Okay, so Amir, may I ask you the next question? So how can we set targets for building that are not covered with a CRREM pathway due to typology or location, and will SBTi building to add new CRREM pathway in the future, when they become available?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one we receive fairly often from stakeholders. So you won't be surprised to hear that. And yeah, thank you for raising this point. So I suppose there's two aspects to this, right? So the one is, if the CRREM pathway doesn't cover your particular case, what should you do? And also whether or not new CRREM pathways that are developed in the future will be added by the SBTi into our buildings tool. So I'll take those two separately. So with regards to building typologies that aren't covered by the available pathway, we recognize that might be the case, and that's why there is the option for an other pathway in the buildings target setting tool. So that can be used, when there isn't a country or asset level type pathway available. The other pathway can be used in that case. And on the question around if new CRREM pathways will be added in future, the answer is, in principle, yes, if the pathways are developed, in the same way and meet the required ambition, then we are certainly willing to take a look at those and add them pending internal approval. So it might be that adoption could be later by the SBTi compared to when the CRREM team releases their publication. But yeah, like I said, definitely we're open always to collaborate and add as many different types of pathways into the tool as possible, pending our own internal processes.
Understand. Thank you, Amir. So, Calvin, may I ask you, Link has committed to this SBTi net zero standard to upgrade the company's net zero strategy. So, can you talk about, Link strategic planning on climate change management to meet the net zero targets and how to prepare for the upcoming needs?
Sure, absolutely. So let me first start by thanking Amir and Maria, or maybe your colleagues. We actually got our SBTi net zero target validated back in September. And also a lot of that had to do with, Julia, the work that you guys have on CRREM. This was instrumental in helping us understand the challenges that we have. Now, that being said, I will say that because we're in different regions in Asia Pacific, mainland China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, the way we are looking at this is trying to find a way to, in a way, translate decarbonization into a very simple language that can be understood across the entire APAC region. And in the end, the way I sum it is actually it's about operational efficiency, energy management. And this is what the operating teams understand. So from that, we don't necessarily communicate a decarbonization strategy as opposed to, look, what is your thinking on energy efficiency? What are the opportunities we have there? And also starting to bring in that discussion of carbon intensity, because in different regions, we have the opportunity to reduce our carbon primarily by, energy consumption. So one caveat I will add is that we primarily own and manage properties. We do very little development, so our carbon footprint is probably not as broad as other real estate companies that do development. On that note, what we also have in place is actually a target to hit net zero by 2035. And the reason for that is because we feel that this will enhance the accountability and ownership of our decarbonization strategy, which I've mentioned primarily is going to be that energy efficiency approach. 2035 also allows us enough time to understand and take into account some of the life cycles of heavy equipment where most of the energy is going to be used. So for example, air conditioning, typically they go through, let's say, a 20-year life cycle, and then you have to start looking at new replacements, which typically tends to be more energy efficient. So over the next few years, we're going to come into that second life of air conditioning heavy equipment. That will be one of our approaches to mitigating this further. The other thing that we're really looking at is actually understanding how putting in place an internal carbon price. This will mirror some of the carbon taxes or carbon prices in certain jurisdictions. So for example, Singapore already has a carbon tax. Australia has something similar. We know that certain different cities in mainland China also have this as well. So this will help us factor into making the financial decision on when to do replacements or what type of equipment to include. Should we spend a little bit more now and then see the benefits later on? So that's my summary. Two things. Number one, translate it, focus on energy efficiency, which is easier for people to understand. Number two, start to explore the use of an internal carbon price so you can start factoring in the future value or price of carbon and then understand how it might impact your decision making now.
Yeah, thank you, Calvin. In fact, I really cannot agree with you more, about focusing on the energy efficiency. And this has also become one of the key topic in other organizations, including CRREM. They also want to focus more on energy efficiency. And coincidentally, in fact, ULI's they published the sustainability outlook for 2024 for the real estate sector. They have also identified energy efficiency as one of the top 5 issues for sustainable real estate, at least, from this year and onwards. So, and also from your sharing, besides energy efficiency and the internal carbon price, I think setting ambitious target and ownership really could help the company to, implement all this climate change strategy and the risk management. Yeah. So thank you very much. My next question to Kurt. So how does the early adopter program demonstrate the effectiveness of CRREM tools in helping the companies achieve the decarbonization targets while addressing the carbon risk associated within the real estate portfolios?
Thank you, Grace. So regarding the effectiveness of the CRREM tool, I think first thing come to my mind would be there's a separation between energy intensity pathway and carbon emission pathway. So the energy intensity pathway will enable the participants to distinguish like the effect of the emission factor. Maybe there's a decarbonization effort in the power generation industry that will affect the overall carbon emission. So the energy intensity pathway will enable them to benchmark their energy efficiency among their peers. And secondly, I think there are plenty of ready-to-use resources in the CRREM-2. Like I said before, there are massive amount of default data. For example, emission factors for to calculate different emissions in the building, and like carbon pricing. It be especially a very good tool for companies to start to research on their transition risk in their portfolio, and also it will include many ready-to-use pathway for different types of building, including offices, including different purposes of retail, like shopping mall, industrial uses like a distribution warehouse, hotel, residential, or a mixed use of the building. Also, I think the tool can help the participants to make some important decision in carbon emission reduction plans and measures, as the tool is able to give out information about the trade-off between the embodied carbon in the replacement of the equipment in retrofit, and avoid the emissions, like the trade-off between the embodied carbon and avoid the emissions by reducing energy consumption for the more efficient equipments. And also, for example, like it can provide some information on the return of investment in retrofits by comparing the upgrading costs and current and future carbon costs over time. Yeah.
Thank you, Kurt. So we have received quite a number of questions from the audience. So let's answer some of the questions now. The first question, sorry, she hasn't sorry, type out who the question is for. So maybe our panelists, you could just jump in. So may I know if the CRREM and SBTi aligned target also take into account the 2060 carbon neutrality target for China? So anyone? Julia, would you like? Or Amir?
Maybe I can jump in,
Yes,
and then Julia, if you have anything to add, feel free to do so. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's quite interesting. So essentially, my response to that would be that, as you might know, SBTi is aligned with the Paris Agreement, which is to reach on a global level net zero by 2050, right? So our pathways, again, are on a global level and are set to reach net zero by 2050, as can be seen in the IEA net zero scenario report, for example. And if there's no reason that companies can't reach that, then there is no need to delay to 2060. You know, we appreciate that grid decarbonization, for example, may depend on country level targets, but companies should still be looking at applying energy efficiency measures and switching to renewable as soon as possible. So yeah, I suppose from SBTi's perspective, it's something that we've drawn a sort of a line in the sand, because we recognize that we need to push everyone. We all need to have this collaborative effort if we are to avoid the worst effects of the climate breakdown. Yeah, that would be our response to the question.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next question is for Julia. How does the CRREM-2 handle incomplete data coverage?
Yeah, thank you, Grace. That's a very good question. And I also see earlier in the chat also some questions. What do I do if I don't have the full data available? Especially tenant data is here always a challenge. Again, just to summarize, CRREM, of course, looks at the whole building. We take the whole building approach. So that's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, also in terms of tenant electricity. And often we don't have, or it's very difficult to get access to that tenant electricity. So I can either say I will make my own projections and assumptions and enter this as an assumption, or I can use the tool to extrapolate that data. I can then enter, I only have the common areas, and the tool will take that on and extrapolate the data. The second point is also, of course, vacancy. Often we don't have the asset fully occupied. And again, we can enter the vacancy data here, and the tool will automatically extrapolate that data to full occupancy and to full coverage. The final point in terms of data coverage is if we don't have data for a full reporting year. Maybe we recently acquired an asset or sold this, and we only have a certain amount of time. And again, the tool can take this forward and extrapolate to the full year.
Thank you, Julia, for the clarification. So,
Great.
yeah,
Could I jump in here as
Calvin,
well?
yes, please.
So one of the challenges that we've had is the data coverage, especially on the tenant side. But one thing that I would highlight to people is that you may actually find out that your tenants are also requesting this information. We're seeing more of our tenants request this information because you have to remember that as a landlord, my scope 2 emissions, which are the energy consumption for the building, the common areas, are actually going to be the scope 3 emissions for the tenants, right? So the tenants need to verify and not justify, but verify that they are operating in a green building and that they're in a low energy building as well. So what we're finding out is there are a lot of tenants, especially those larger MNC tenants or the ones that are listed, that actually want our data on the common areas. So what we've been able to do in certain situations is actually have an agreement. Look, we need your scope 2 data, and you need our scope 2 data. So let's agree to exchange this information. And that's been actually quite helpful for us in regards to getting a fuller version of the tenant emissions data. Now, once you have that, it's a little bit more accurate when you extrapolate by sector and tenant type. So that is one way to bridge that gap. But I suspect a lot of landlords will start seeing tenants requesting this information as well.
Thank you, Calvin, for the tips. Yes, data sharing would be very helpful, for tenants and also the landlord, and also they could align the interests and also some of those practices and strategies that reduce the carbon footprint of the building together as well. So the next question for SBTi, so maybe Amir or Maria could answer it. So how can a company best choose a method for developing its net zero target?
Yeah, I can jump in there. Thanks, Grace. Thanks for the question. So I suppose the first thing to say, as mentioned, the buildings guidance and tool is in the very final stages of the pilot testing phase, which means that although they are being interrogated through a select group of companies and financial institutions, using the tool, submitting evidence, they can't be used to submit targets for official validation yet. But we expect to publish the approved versions in the coming months. So as mentioned, the companies and financial institutions operating in the sector can refer to the building's resources to determine if the guidance applies to them and how they might be defined in terms of user types and what target setting methods they must or could use to set their net zero target. But one thing to note is that the content may change in the final version. And perhaps the most important point here that I'd like to flag is that the existing cross-sector methods can be used. The SBTi criteria net zero standard can be consulted already for companies in the sector to submit their targets for validation. So there isn't necessarily a need to wait for the buildings guidance. And if you were to, for example, submit your targets using the existing methods, once we release the guidance and tool and final versions, we wouldn't, retrospectively ask companies to resubmit again. That would only take place, for example, at the 5-year stage when all companies need to resubmit regardless. And if the buildings guidance applies to you and is mandatory, then you would use that as appropriate. Or if, for example, you want to voluntarily update and use the new guidance, or if there's any significant changes in your inventory or portfolio, which means that might trigger a recalculation, then you would need to use the buildings guidance. But I suppose to answer the question, there's no need to delay. You can use the existing methods, but we're hoping as well at the same time in the coming months to release the final version. And of course, that will be communicated to all quite widely. So yeah, thanks for the question again.
Hey, thank you very much, Amir. Yes, we looking forward to the final version. Yes. So the next question I think is for Julia. How does CRREM benefit companies that have already set science-based target?
I think that's also a good question, but I also think we already covered a lot of those points. Of course, you can have on company level, you can have the targets, and then CRREM, you can also, of course, here set the targets or view it on an asset level and directly also tackle, okay, in my portfolio, what are my best performers? What are my worst performers? You can directly see, okay, where am I currently standing at? And also here use this to align your strategy moving forward. When do I want to do an energetic retrofit? How does my portfolio look like on a whole? And just because CRREM is here also, again, you can use it on a global level. So if your company or larger player, you also have an international portfolio. And here you can also directly use this then for a like comparison. Also with different asset types and assets located in different countries as well.
Thank you, Julia. So some benchmarking and comparison result would be useful. And I think the next question is for Kurt. So for the early adopter program, what is the timeline for data collection?
Thank you, Grace. And also thank you for this question. We currently receive plenty of inquiries and also feedbacks from potential participants. Because the CRREM tools could be like relatively new to many of the companies. So we are studying those questions and feedbacks and adjusting our timelines according to those inquiries. So we will release the latest timetable and further details on the program as soon as possible.
Thank you, Kurt. So I think this question is for Julia. So how does the CRREM pathway compare with IPCCs?
Yeah, that's also, of course, a good question. Regarding the global budget, here, of course, we always try to align with all of the publications and sources here. So here also looking at the figures published here to then create one global pathway. So here again, these figures and these sources are also directly aligned with SBTi. And then we also take it that step further to create those country level and property type specific pathways. But all of these converge and align back to that global pathway.
Thank you very much for clarification. So I think the next question is also for Julia. Does the CRREM model have mostly data for building types like residential and shopping centers? How about mixed use of office and retail? Or must our data of mixed use building be broken down by retail and office before using the CRREM tool?
Okay, that's also a good question. First of all, I will clarify how we get the starting points. In most countries, we have, I'm not doing desk research, we have we're lucky enough to have data partners in most of the countries that provide us the data to get those starting points and really accurate and high quality benchmarks. And if you're as a user now entering the data into the CRREM tool, the tool, if you enter mixed use, the tool will automatically create a weighted pathway. So residential starts normally a little bit lower than a hotel or a retail asset. They normally start a little bit higher. Of course, they're more energy intensive and so on. So they start a bit higher. And if you enter that data, you don't need it split up. You can have the data on whole building. So you don't need a separate meter for the different areas. The tool will automatically create that weighted pathway.
Thank you, Julia. Next question, I think, is for Calvin. Link has a diversified portfolio across different regions, especially in mainland China and Singapore. So what are the challenges to achieve SBTi net zero targets given their different climate management policy in these regions?
Well, I think I alluded to it earlier on. The key challenge is just the understanding of the word decarbonization, right? We need to speak in terms that the operators, the property managers really have spoken in the last couple of decades. And again, it's making it as simple as possible. Talk about energy efficiency. I mean, even sometimes saying decarbonization in Cantonese, Mandarin, and so forth, it's complicated. So the key is, again, simplify that language, set it as energy efficiency, because if you can reduce energy efficiency or talk about from an operational perspective, we're already going to get that savings, right? Literally from the costs as well. So I think that's really the key to overcome some of that challenge. The other thing is that because the different jurisdictions also have different policies or even incentives, it's important to let the local teams encourage them to take ownership of this. So one thing that we've done with our mainland China portfolio is actually speak to each of the assets, because we're in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and so forth. And understand that, you know, some of the work that they do is actually procuring energy. They procure energy through a local provider, and encouraging to speak with other partners on understanding what are the partners' decarbonization strategies, how that might factor in into, you know, the operation side of the shopping centers as well. So that's been the other thing to do. So my summary is, you know, translate, keep it as simple as possible, energy efficiency, operational efficiency. That's a language that they've been speaking. And then number two, empower the local teams to take ownership of this, because they will be the ones that know what's going on in the different regions.
Thank you very much, Calvin. Yes, the next question is for Amir or Julia. It's about CRREM's whole building approach allows the use of market-based accounting for tenant Scope 2 emissions, while building sector SBT does not. Would there be any correction incorporated in the reduction trajectories in the building sector SBT, final version, I think, to take into account the constraints on the use of renewable energy in tenant areas?
Perhaps I can come in here. Thank you for the question, and thanks, Grace, for raising this. And yeah, you are right that the draft guidance that we released for public consultation that didn't allow market-based accounting for Scope 2 emissions. However, we've listened to the feedback that we've received, and we've also undergone a sort of intensive internal review of what we've proposed, and we've decided to essentially align with the sort of approach taken by the SBTi as a whole, in that location-based and market-based accounting for Scope 2 are now permitted. So that's one thing to just clarify here. Yeah, you can use market-based accounting for your Scope 2 emissions and to set your target in that way if you so choose. One requirement we do still keep and have is that companies should also submit their location-based accounting data as part of the validation process. So we would have both sets. If you wanted to also use market-based accounting, you feel free to. You can do that now as an option to set your targets, but we'd also like to see the location-based element there as well. So yeah, just a clarification that market-based is permitted now. And of course, like I mentioned, that will come into effect when we release the guidance, and then there's 6 months following that, where there's a grace period, and in that grace period, you can still use the existing cross-sector methods if you are an intended user of the building's resources.
Okay, thank you, Amir. Okay, this is an interesting question, I think, to Julia. We understand the CRREM typically calculates intensity based on internal floor area. So do you have any suggestion for the companies that only track the construction floor area or gross floor area, but not the internal floor area?
Yeah, this is also a good question. And I think globally, I mean, the best practice would be IPMS2, the International Property Measurement Standard 2. But of course, in most countries, the floor areas, really everyone has their own independent way to, even in the countries, we have differences how to measure the area. We always say, okay, if this, maybe you can strive to that in the future, where we can also, the sector can align on one global way to measure the floor area. But I think this is still maybe a little bit away. If you don't have it, often also here in Europe, companies use a conversion factor. This is already the first step. Maybe, of course, you then in the future want to get more accurate here. But if this is not possible in a very quick way to implement this, maybe you can use a factor here to convert it. And what I always say, very important, that what input you have, so or emissions, that they match the denominator here also. So the best practice would also be, okay, you exclude the outdoor floor area, you also exclude any parking area, and you should also exclude the emissions from those areas. So you shouldn't use the outdoor emissions, and also for the parking, that also includes any electricity for the e-vehicle charging stations. So just make sure that the match here is also given.
Thank you, Julia. So next question for Amir. So for SBTi, should we go for the building sector guide, or in general, if we are to submit decarbonization strategy for validation in 2024?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Again, one we've received quite a lot actually over the last month or two. And what I would say about that is, again, the buildings guidance and tools that you will be able to eventually use to set your targets isn't available yet. So the version we have on the webpage is draft. So by all means, take a look at that, familiarize yourself with that in preparation. But right now, you can definitely use the cross-sector methods, the existing methods to set your targets. So I would encourage you, if you are looking to do so, nothing holding you back, please do go ahead and do that. The other thing I would like to highlight is that our next slots for validation, I believe, are in June 2024. So that's the earliest that the validation team could look at your targets. So please bear that in mind in case you might be wanting to wait for the buildings guidance. That there's quite a lot of demand. So I would always urge you to get your submission slot in as early as possible to avoid disappointment, especially if you're looking at 2024. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you, Amir. So I'm cautious of time. So this is the last question. I think it's for Kurt. Can we know how much data input we need to make for the early adopter program?
Thank you, Grace. For the effort we would like our participants to put in this program, I think it would depend on the selected scope that the participant is interested in. And also there's some essential data for the transaction risk assessment, because though I've said there are some optional ones, I think the most important one would be the electricity consumption, at least in the common area. And if you are lacking the electricity consumption from the tenants, I would suggest you to make some effort, like try to get it from them. If there's still lacking of data, it'd be suggested to making estimation based on the location of the building and also the use of the type of use of the building. And apart from that, it'd be appreciated if you also can provide data on the renewable energy, no matter if it's on-site or off-site. And also there's some general information needed from buildings, and I think it'd be relatively easy to acquire the the floor area just mentioned, and also the gross asset value would be a good metric for the intensity calculation.
Thank you so very much. So I believe this wrap up our Q&A session. So thank you to all our panelists for your participation, your sharing, your insights, and also answering all the questions. And also thanks to our audience for submitting the questions. So let me pass the time to our host.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you to all the speakers for your time and the insightful sharing. Now, I would like to invite all the panelists to take a picture and smile at the camera so we could commemorate this webinar. So on the count of 3, please smile at the camera. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much. And this is the end of our webinar. And thank you to everyone for joining us. And please fill out the questionnaire afterwards and feel free to contact us if you have any questions about the webinar. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.